Hello and welcome to the IOSH Podcast Trailblazer Talks, a new series recorded at the 2024 Health and Safety event in Birmingham. In episode 4, Leeds University's Jim Baxter and Simon Cassin from IOSH Learning and Development talk to us about ethics and how they can empower the profession. We're here today in the IOSH podcast booth with Jim Baxter from Leeds University and Simon Cassin from IOSH Learning and Development. Thank you very much for joining me here today in the booth. It's really good to have you here. How are you doing?
Yeah, great. Yeah, it's really nice to, obviously we've been on the panel, that's really good, and have a look around the event. There's loads of great stuff going on. So yeah, all good, thank you.
Yeah, really enjoying it, and thanks very much for having us on.
Brilliant. Okay, well, let's get started. First of all, for our listeners and our viewers, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Okay, yeah. So my name's Simon. A very sort of brief one. I was in the army for a bit when I left school, and then I was in the fire service for many years. I can't remember the exact time, about 17, 18 years, something like that. And I was a station officer in the fire service. I was involved in an accident there, so I had to sort of reinvent myself. And I moved into the health and safety world, did your normal diploma thing, and then Portsmouth University did some stuff there. And and did training consultancy and all that sort of stuff. About 10 years ago, I saw that across our industry, there was a greater emphasis on thinking about behaviour. So the question was, well, how do I get people to be safe? How do I get people to not do this and do that? And I read, not all the books, but all the ones that were out, you know what I mean, don't you? I read all those kind of books. And I thought to myself, I don't really understand this enough. So I need to know some more. So I did a joint degree in philosophy and psychology through the OU. And when I did that, it gave me a much better understanding of, to be honest, how little I know. I mistakenly believed I knew more than I did, and now I'm much better at that. Now, one of the things that I did on there as part of the philosophy element, and also the psychology as well, actually, was looking at morality and ethics. And the more and more I thought about it, the more I realised that the whole health and safety industry is, or profession, should we say, is basically something that is trying to improve ethics, improve standards, to keep people safe in the workplace. And so actually, if you were thinking about it, health and safety is a subset of applied ethics. So I thought, I'm going to need to know more about that to have any kind of reasonable understanding of it. And just to confirm, across our industry, there are very few people, to my knowledge, who have studied either philosophy or ethics, but there are many people who talk about it. And what I wanted to do is to gain an understanding of that. And so I looked all around, where I could learn a little bit more and everything. And where Jim wasn't one of my lecturers, but at Jim's university, they did an applied and professional ethics module course in a master's. So I signed up for that, and it was just great. So I did that. I did the master's in that, and I think I'm just kind of going on now. So that'll do, won't it? You don't cut to whatever you're supposed to say.
We can carry right on. So you know what you're talking about. So it's very good to have you here. And Jim, can you tell me a bit about yourself?
Certainly. So I'm an academic ethicist. So I studied philosophy at university way back in the mist of time, and then went and worked as a project manager in e-learning for a few years, and then came back into academia, and I now work at the University of Leeds at the centre where Simon did his master's, which is called the Idea Centre, which is an applied ethics centre based in the School of Philosophy, essentially, at Leeds. So I've got a PhD in ethics. My PhD was about psychopaths, whether psychopaths are morally responsible for their actions, and I wrote a book about that. But most of my job, which is really unusual for an academic, is as a consultant. In fact, full-time, apart from the research I do and a bit of teaching, I work as a consultant. And the great majority of the work that I do as a consultant has been with professional bodies. So we work, for example, with the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, with the Royal Academy of Engineering, the Institute of Engineering and Technology. At the moment, I'm just at the beginning of a project with the Law Society, looking at the ethics of in-house solicitors. So kind of partly, I suppose, prompted by things like the post office scandal, for example, and the actions that lawyers appear to have taken as part of that scandal. So we do that kind of stuff. It's like applied research projects. We do CPD and training and so on for ethicists as well. And I would be remiss if I didn't just get a quick plug in for the podcast where I get to ask the questions, which is called Ethics Untangled. So we have a podcast at the centre.
Yes, I've come across that. Really interesting. So you're both really, really well placed to be here today to talk about ethics and professional ethics. So really looking forward to this conversation. I know, as you said, you've just come off the stage of IOSH's keynote theatre talking about ethics. And I know Stuart opened that panel debate earlier today with this question, but I think listeners would be really interested to hear from you here on the IOSH podcast and would really like to hear your thoughts. So what does it mean to be a professional, and what does ethics have to do with it?
I think you could ask lots of different people and get lots of different answers, but there's definitely going to be some element in there that's got things like there's got to be a certain standard of competency or expertise. I'm just thinking of one list here, and it says that there's an intellectual basis. So there's got to be some kind of depth of knowledge which has been externally approved. It's not just experience, something that's been judged to a certain standard. I think it's definitely got to have that. I think that there must be some element of service. We're doing something that is better for society, something that society needs. We all need other people to help us with things, don't we? There's definitely that. It fills some kind of space of what society needs. What else does it might it have in there? I think there's going to be some kind of professional body normally, so that there can be an approved standard and somebody to keep their eye on that. And there's definitely going to be something like that. And normally with that will be some kind of code of conduct. Something like that. I think there's at least that. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And how about you, Jim?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. Actually, firstly, just to say that there are kind of different ways that we use the word professional. It might be useful just to kind of say a bit about some senses that I think is not what we're discussing here, right? So firstly, there's a sense of professional, which just means it's something you're paid to do, right? You're either an amateur or you're a professional. You have professional footballers, right? We don't mean that. We also I don't think what we really have in mind here is just the sense of a job well done, right? If somebody does a professional job, that can just mean they've taken a lot of care.
Well, you could have a plasterer that does a professional job.
Done a professional job, or, anybody could really, right? Somebody working in a shop could do a professional job, a cleaner, whatever, right? So we're not talking about that. So we're talking about a kind of richer sense of a profession, like, for example, lawyers are professionals, right? We would probably agree that lawyers are professionals, or should be. Doctors are professionals, and so on. And I think what that means, like this, the simplest way of defining that sense of professionalism is that it's an area of work where, on the one hand, as Simon said, there's a high degree of kind of specialized knowledge and skills that people have, right? And those specialized knowledge and skills are not available to the general public, right? So if I go and see my doctor and sort of describe my symptoms, that doctor's going to know a lot more about anatomy and physiology and pharmacology and all that kind of stuff than I am. So it's going to be difficult for me to assess what that person is going to say to me, right? If they're getting it wrong, it's going to be difficult for me to know that they're getting it wrong. So there's what we call asymmetry of knowledge and skills. I don't have it, the professional does. Yeah. And on the other hand, the work that professional does is going to have a high degree of impact on me, whether it's positive or negative, right? So those two things, I think, define what it is to be a professional. And taking those two things together, I think we can conclude that professionalism is all about ethics, right? So if the professional has no choice but to be trusted by the client and by the public, right? The public has got to put their trust in the professional. They just don't have any choice about it. It's not like I can decide not to trust the medical profession, right? And I'm going to have to trust them at some point. And the impact that they can have on me is quite profound. That means they better have my interests at heart, and they better know what they're doing, right? So they better be competent on the one hand, and they better be ethically motivated on the other, right? They have to have the right kind of motivation. And both of those things are ethical considerations. Clearly, the professional having the client's interests at heart is an ethical consideration, but also the competence side is as well, because if my doctor's not competent, well, I have a right to expect that they are competent, right? So if they're not competent, then they're violating my rights. So that's an ethical consideration as well. So really, to me, and a lot of it's about trust as well, right? We have to trust professionals. So to me, professionalism is just inherently about ethics.
Yeah, really interesting, stripping it right back like that, I think. So what does it mean to have good ethical comprehension?
Okay, so let's think about two things. So if we think about the health and safety world, to be professional, okay, and to be ethical as a health and safety professional, we need to understand two things. We need one component, we need to understand safety, and we need to understand ethics. So when we're talking about ethical comprehension, we need to be able to recognize the ethical implications of what we do and who might be affected and in what way that might be affected. So let's think about it like this. Have you ever been on a course for something? So what was the last course you went on? I'll turn it around. Can you remember?
It was probably some sort of e-learning course on a journalism e-learning course.
Okay. So after you did that course, did some of the things that you were on that course, I mentioned on that course, did you see them in a way that previously you hadn't?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So that's what we mean.
Yeah.
So that's what I want us to be able to do as a profession. I want us to be able to see ethical issues which previously were unseeable or unknowable.
Right.
Because we do have power. We do have the ability to impact people's lives. We do give expert advice, and some of it is, can cause significant, is preventing obviously physical health or safety issues. We do say, listen, you've got to spend a lot of money on that new machine, so we're giving advice that impacts the people who we serve. The ethical comprehension element of that is that not only think about the safety bit, but think about the ethical impact on a wider group of stakeholders. And in order to see that, we need to have that greater ethical comprehension. Without it, you just can't see it. It doesn't mean that that we want to be that we want to coerce people, or we want to behave in a bad way, or we want to steal or be dishonest, or it doesn't mean that. It just means I just can't see it. I didn't know. Wow, blinky deck. Like you saw things after your course that were not as obvious before you did it.
Yeah.
I think that's what I take it to be.
And it was mentioned earlier before about trust and how that's linked to ethics. How do you see that?
So I think Jim said earlier in the podcast, he said that the public have a right to expect certain standards from the medical profession. Yeah. So Jim on the panel as well explained it really well. He said that there are some parts of society where we have no choice to trust.
Yeah.
Okay. And Jim used the excellent example of a bank. I'll tell you what, can we ask Jim this? Because his example was much better than mine.
Jim, do you want to give us the
okay?
example?
Sure, yeah. So in the panel event, I asked the people in the audience, right? First of all, do you trust bankers? Like, do you generally think that bankers are trustworthy people? And I didn't expect it to be quite like this, but literally nobody put their hand up, did they? Right. So, and that kind of matches, I think, the general research that's been done on this. So there's a thing called the Edelman Trust Barometer, which comes out every year. Bankers are always quite low in the list of trusted professions, right? So I asked that, and then I asked who has a bank account, and everybody put their hand up, obviously, because everybody's got a bank account. Now, what does that show? Well, it shows that there's a difference between explicit and implicit trust, right? So explicitly, people were saying they don't trust bankers. Implicitly, they're happy to hand their money over to bankers to look after, right? So there's a sense in which they do trust bankers. Now, that's not to say that really what they're doing is kind of contradictory, because they don't have a choice about the implicit bit, right?
Yeah.
You just can't not have a bank account. You can't have a job, or, you know, there's all sorts of things you can't do if you don't have a bank account. So there's a sense in which just by living in society, we implicitly trust people from all sorts of different professions. And I think the health and safety profession is an obvious example of that, right? So, you know, if you go to work in a building and, you know, interact with people and, you know, do all the stuff that you have to do as part of your job, there's a sense in which you're implicitly trusting the organization that you work for, and by extension, the people who are employed by that organization, to safeguard your health and safety, right? So there's implicit trust, which people don't have a choice about. The question is, do people explicitly trust health and safety professionals? And I'm not, by the way, not saying that they don't. It would be interesting to look at statistics on that. It'd be interesting to ask people. But if somebody, so the point I want to make is that the implicit trust is something we don't have a choice about, but that means that there's a responsibility on those people to earn that trust, right? People are going to be putting their trust in you. You better make sure that you're acting in a trustworthy way. Now, the other thing to say is that not earning that trust is not necessarily a matter of being badly motivated. So I'm sure everybody joins the health and safety profession in order to do good, right? They're not kind of going into work trying to do evil, obviously, but you aren't earning people's trust if you aren't consistently applying standards, if you're not thinking really carefully about the decisions that you're making, if you're kind of letting things kind of flow over you and not kind of paying proper attention to them. So to go back to that point about was it ethical awareness that you were talking about?
Comprehension.
Ethical comprehension. I think that's, as Simon was saying, it's partly about spotting ethical issues, but it's also when you spot one, thinking really carefully and analytically about it. And in order to do that, you have to have the conceptual tools to do that, right? So what we're trying to do, or what I'm trying to do with my team as ethicists, is to try and give people those conceptual tools so that they can have productive conversations about the decisions that they have to make, the situations they find themselves in, and be really well informed about those decisions that they have to make, and make those decisions in the light of a proper understanding of the ethical considerations, right? So that's kind of ethical comprehension, and you need that as well as the motivation in order to be properly trustworthy and properly earning the trust that's placed in you.
We had a panel briefing on ethics a couple of months ago. We first met and we discussed this. And for our listeners, can you just outline, Jim, the difference? What's the difference between morals and ethics?
Well, I don't think there is a difference, actually.
Don't? Okay.
I mean, I think basically morality comes from Latin and ethics comes from Greek, and that's basically the difference. Mm-hmm. I mean, what sometimes you find that people say when drawing that distinction, what they're trying to get at is a difference between maybe professional ethics and personal morality, right? So I would just say personal ethics versus professional ethics, right? So your personal ethics is just extremely wide-ranging. It incorporates, you know, how you treat your friends, you know, what you think your responsibilities are to your family, for example, obviously really important for most people. Maybe your kind of political convictions, you know, what you think you should be doing as a member of society. And all of those things are motivated probably by a set of values, which might include fairness, maybe equality, something like that, maybe honesty, maybe, you know, you really think of yourself as an honest person, that's very important to you. Professional ethics it's going to use the same values, actually. The values aren't really going to be significantly different. But where professional ethics differs is that in order to understand what those values require of you in what can be quite complex work situations, you have to think a bit more carefully and a bit more kind of rigorously. And there's a value in having guidance and codes of conduct and so on to help you really think about, for example, conflicts of interest, right? Conflicts of interest arise because we have interest in all sorts of different things. Sometimes those things can be in tension. For professionals, conflicts of interest are just really important because they can get in the way of your ability to do your job well, right? So conflicts of interest are something that professionals have to think about. But it's all within the same kind of value framework. It's all about kind of treating people fairly and doing the right thing. But it's just that the kind of complexity of the situations is increased, and therefore you have to think a bit more carefully about what those things mean in practice.
Sorry, can I just add something to that? Okay, so I think one of the things that we need to, I want to say something about the trust as well, if that's okay. So is it possible that I might trust that you think you're saying the right thing, but not trust that you have the capability or the competency to say the right thing? So could I trust that the health and safety officer is doing their best, but not trust that in their level of knowledge or understanding that what they're saying is true? Could that be the case?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. So that further, I don't know if complicates is the right word, but it adds an extra layer of thought about trust. I might trust you, but not trust what you've said.
Right.
Which are different things. Yeah. So as a health and safety professional, I may or may not trust you, but I really need to trust what you've said. I really need to trust that you've said, if I wear this mask, it will protect me from this dust. Because I might trust you as a person, but the moment I can't trust the mask is the right mask, we've got problems, haven't we?
Yeah.
And so these are things as well. These are ongoing discussions that the health and safety industry has never really looked at in any depth going forward. Previously. And we're going to have to look at these things if we genuinely want to see ourselves as a profession that can support society, sustainability going forward. We definitely need this ability.
Okay, so what are the ethical principles that should govern and validate our decision making in the workplace, and how should these principles be used in practice?
Well, I'm going to answer this question by saying I can't tell you what that is. So in January, I think Duncan Spencer wrote an article.
He did, yeah.
And I thought that article was pretty good, actually. I was very impressed by it. And the bit that I was most impressed, that relates to your question, was that Duncan didn't attempt to say what the ethical principles were. And I'm going to follow his lead because I think that's the way forward.
Yeah.
I think the way forward is for the health and safety profession to have a deep and meaningful discussion and decide what it thinks is appropriate principles that relate to the particularities of health and safety. I don't think anyone else can tell us what they are, and I don't think any one person can tell us what they are. I think I'll pass over to Jim because I think he talked about the commonality and crossover of principles and values anyway. So
yeah, no, I completely agree. It's hard to add anything to that really, apart from just to kind of emphasize, as Simon said, that like it's a conversation the profession as a whole needs to have. So every profession is its members, right? The profession is not just a professional body. The profession is its membership.
Absolutely.
So it's incumbent on the membership to have that conversation, decide what they think the values and principles that should be guiding their behavior are. And then that's kind of, crystallized by the professional body, I suppose.
So watch this space, listeners. So how can we look to make ethical decisions in the workplace? And what's the model that you mentioned in the panel, Jim?
Okay, so I think there's a lot that you can say about ethical decision making. I would say, first of all, that you shouldn't be looking for a process for ethical decision making, really. So quite often what people say is what we need is a framework. And by framework, sometimes you feel that what they have in mind is a process, right? So I've got this decision, I feed it into one end of the process, out the other end of the process drops the correct answer to that decision. I don't think that's how ethical decision making works. But I think there is another sense of framework which I think is helpful, which is that you point to different elements of the ethical decision and you give people the resources to think carefully and critically about each of those elements. Now, for example, I would say that one of the things that you need to do is to separate the facts about the decision from the values that are at play in the decision. So you need to understand all the facts or all the facts that are relevant to the decision, but just knowing the facts isn't going to tell you what to do, because you can't make a decision just with facts. You need values as well. You need to know what's at stake. For example, is this something to do with fairness or honesty? But more than that, what does fairness and honesty actually mean, right? What does that actually mean in the context of this decision? You know, what's going to be the action which values fairness more highly, right? And so on. So that's part of it. Another thing is stakeholders in the decision, right? So we were talking about stakeholder decision-making models earlier. And the kind of classic stakeholder decision-making model is you talk about the influence that people can have and the power that people have. And then you kind of plot them on this kind of graph. So you've got an x-axis of maybe influence and y-axis of power or something like that. And then you kind of decide where each stakeholder is, and that tells you what to do. But what that ignores completely is what are your responsibilities to each stakeholder, right? So I think in order to make an ethical decision, you need a z-axis on that graph. So you need to know the power and influence and so on, but you also need to know what are my responsibilities? What are my duties to these people? Because if I'm not fulfilling my duties in the decision that I make, then it's not an ethical decision. So yeah, that's a couple of examples. I think there are other things that you can say.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a start.
So we were talking about membership organisations earlier, and IOSH's Code of Ethics commits members to its vision for a world that is safe, healthy and sustainable. It provides an ethical foundation for members working towards this vision. And it says, from such a foundation, a good professional reputation can be built. Can you unpick this, Simon?
But there's lots of, like I say, there's lots of different bits in there. Okay, so let's look at one part. Let's look at a reputation of a profession and how a code of conduct can help with that. Okay, so how do we build a reputation? How do we get our people's views of us? Well, I think one of the ways is that people can see consistently over time that we performed to a reasonable standard. That's one of the ways people can go, well, you know what, health and safety profession, you know, they're consistently behaving in this way, and, you know, I think that we can rely on them. Yeah, there's also a difference between trust and reliance, but anyway, maybe we'll talk about that another day. Okay, so what we've got to be able to do is there, because it was, if I'm going off track of the question, please forgive me. I think what we've got to be able to show there is that we have the tools or have the academic capability or the epistemic capability to think about the challenges that we might have going forward. So when you talk about sustainability, okay, so sustainability is something that we understand. We understand it, but not because of sustainability. We understand it because of this, so far as is reasonably practicable. Mm-hmm. So there is a lot of ethics and a lot of philosophy in the health and safety at work, believe it or not. Yeah. Stuff that is in there, and blinking heck, I didn't even know that was. So what that says is this. That says that we should invest the right time and effort and money and experience and expertise and whatnot and equipment and all that, dependent on how serious the thing is. Yeah? Mm-hmm. Now let's have a think about that approach in relation to sustainable work, to changes, impacts on the environment, businesses that can make money and provide jobs and whatnot. So I think what I'm trying to say there is we've done it with the nuts and bolts of safety so far is reasonably practicable. If we can develop our ability to understand ethical principles and develop ethical skills, I think that's one of the things. An ability to recognise, take a step back and think about the issues. In the great example that Jim gave us there, we could definitely follow that sort of model to help us. So there are so many different questions which at the moment I don't believe we're in a position to ask or even to comprehend. So, for example, what are our ethical responsibilities to people who are not yet born? What are they? And where do they come from? We can't discuss that.
No.
We can go, oh, well, you just got to do the right stuff.
Yeah.
But that's
what
not
is the right? Yeah.
that's not good enough.
No.
People like Jim, ethicists, people like Jim, they're asking these questions. So they can help us develop our ability to think about our practice going forward and how we can support society and the future of society and the planet as well.
And so digging deeper, Jim, what's the concept of safety in ethics?
That is a tough one. I was thinking about this in advance of this interview, what I was going to say about this. I mean, I would say, so I'm not going to give you a complete answer to this, but what I'm going to say is that safety is an ethical value, right? But it's one ethical value among many, right? So you might think, well, I suppose a really naive kind of answer, what should we do about safety? Like, what are our ethical duties with regard to safety? The naive answer would be, well, we should try and make everybody perfectly safe. But of course, nobody's perfectly safe. We're not perfectly safe here, right? Let alone kind of if your job is a firefighter or like a rescue diver or something like that. Nobody's perfectly safe. So maybe we try and maximize safety. But again, there are some jobs where actually just you have to recognize that safety is going to be compromised to some extent. And so you're in the kind of business of balancing that value of safety against other values, right? And making a judgment about in a given situation. To what extent are we happy that safety is going to be compromised or is going to come out as less important in that balance against other values? But I think you can't make effective decisions or you can't make well-informed decisions until you kind of accept that and you see that, right? You see that safety isn't just a kind of ultimate value, and nor is health, right? These are values, but they are going to have to be balanced against other values and weighed in the decisions that you're making. So that's all I'm going to say about that. I think there's probably, I need to go away and think more about
there's so much food for thought in that though. Thank you. So let's talk about power within ethics. So Simon, many of IOSH professionals do have a position of power where lives are literally in their hands. So in that place of powerful decision making and responsibility, how can one maintain ethical dignity?
Okay, so I agree with you definitely that health and safety professionals have some kind of power, either over our customers or over employees within businesses. Definitely agree with that. So let's look at this statement. We've all heard of this, haven't we? Knowledge is power. Yeah, Francis Bacon, I think it was. Knowledge is power. So what does that mean? Well, if I have information and facts, let's say facts or information, which is going to help you be safer or be more productive or whatever, that knowledge or information is beneficial to you, isn't it? Yeah. So when our customers, when they come to us, they're vulnerable. Because they come to us, why? Well, if they knew it themselves, why would they come to us? They'd just do it themselves, wouldn't they? But they don't. They go, well, I need to manage the machinery we're working with, or our heavy goods vehicles, or our chemicals, or our scaffolding jobs, or whatever. Well, but we know we don't really understand that. So what we're going to do is we're going to come to you. Now, you're now in a position of power, okay, but you're only in that, you're the safety person, you're only in that position of power because society has facilitated that and said, okay, you have a right to give us advice as long as that advice is good, and that advice is in our interest, not yours. So I may have power, but that power means that I've got to utilize it or wield it, as in knowledge, should we say that in experience, for your benefit rather than just for mine. Now, to say that to be a health and safety officer, everything we've got to do is for the sake of somebody else, and we should never make a decision that's good for us. Well, I think that's a bit demanding, really. We've all got mortgages and cars and, I don't know, hobbies and whatever it is we have. And I think what we've got to try and do is go, well, okay, whose interests are, so the advice I'm giving, whose interests is this in? Is it mainly in my interest, so, whether it be financial or career or whatever that might be, or is it fundamentally in your interests, the customer, the person doing the job? And I believe that what we've got to do is always keep that scale that's in favour of the customer rather than us. But, we're not saints. We do need to earn a living. And we don't want to make it over demanding on health and safety professionals. But we've got to try and, again, we're looking for that golden mean, that balance, the reasonable balance. That's what we're after. But if I could just say something here. So this is sort of technical health and safety. So we've got hierarchy of control measures. Yeah. I'm sure you heard of that, haven't you? Yeah, okay. So our customers come to us and they go, right, okay, well, can you help us with health and safety? And we go, well, I'm going to really simplify it, obviously. Well, this is a problem. And the way that we can overcome this problem is through control measures. Okay. So let's imagine the problem we had was raising the alarm if there was a fire in the workplace. And I would say, as a safety officer or fire officer, whatever, I'd say, well, we need to get an alarm fitted in there. And it's probably going to be a smoke detector. And when it goes off, it'll detect smoke, and then there'll be a siren, and we can all hear it, and we can go and stand outside. And yeah. So what do we do with that? We install it, we check it works, and every week we go back and go, yeah, that seems to work, and we do that, don't we?
Yeah.
Right. So now let's come down the hierarchy to safe systems and work and training. Right. What is it? It's a control measure. If the control measure doesn't work, should we as the health and safety professionals be raising that issue? Because if the alarm doesn't work, we'd say, whoa, you can't do that, get a new alarm. But if the training doesn't work or the safe system of work can't be followed, this is where I think we need to really confirm the power, the advice we're giving. Is it possible for people to be safe, to follow the system? Is it preferable for them to do it? And if it's not those two things, I think that we are misusing our power. That was a long answer. I don't know if that helps.
No, it's really good. It's really good to have those examples as well, because I think the listeners will really be able to relate to that. I've got another tricky one that you may well have thought about, Jim. What does harm mean in the context of ethics?
Yeah, well, that is an enormous question. You've probably kind of unwittingly stumbled into an area where reams and reams and reams of paper have been used in trying to answer that question. So I'll start the answer off, and then I am going to hand over to Simon because his master's dissertation was on this. So he probably has the right answers to this. But basically, the simple answer to me is that harm is something which affects people's well-being, right? So if you harm me, then my well-being as a result of that harm is reduced. And I think so that could encompass all sorts of different things. I think it's worth kind of emphasizing, of course, and I think this is something which is reasonably well recognized within the health and safety sector at the moment, is that that's not just physical harm, right?
Yeah.
So physical well-being, but also it could be psychological, mental well-being, and so on, could be compromised. But yeah, I'll hand over to Simon because I'm sure he's got a better answer than me.
I don't know if it's a better answer, but it's just I'm fascinated by this, and I'm not saying I can tell you what it is. I'm not saying that, but if you think for a profession where the term harm is kind of pretty important, isn't it? I'm not aware we've ever really talked about this. what does it mean?
Mm.
We've got people who say zero harm. No one should ever be harmed. No one should ever go to work and ever be harmed at work. Okay, what does harm mean?
Mm.
We need to understand that. So, have the health and safety world ever talked about this? Yes. The health and safety executive have been talking about this for years. And they give a great example where what they say is they're talking about what outcomes, and we'll call it harm, society is aligned with societal values. And they give an example where people are carrying out work that will result in bruised knees, not long-term damage. We're not talking you're going to need a knee operation or, something awful like that. Bruised knees. So if we see having a bruise as being harm, well, that becomes too demanding. The health and safety executive is saying, well, hold on a minute, that's not really what we mean by harm. What we mean is building on what Jim said, something that has a severe detrimental effect to our interests, to our well-being. Broken arm, well, that's going to have a severe, that's going to affect me at work and playing, looking after the kids and driving and all. Well, that is definitely harm then, isn't it? Yeah.
So do you mean that there's an acceptable level of harm?
Right. Well, first of all, there's two things here. First of all, I don't believe a bruise actually constitutes harm, because I don't believe, I know we can think of bruises that could constitute harm, but a bruise on the back of my hand, I don't think that has a severe detrimental effect on most people's well-being. I don't think it does. So for me, I'm not so sure that's harm. I think difference is not the same as harm.
Right.
Let's look at it from a different perspective. Let's say you drop 1 pence on the floor and I pick it up. Do you have less money now than you had before?
Yeah.
So you're leaving this place with less in your pocket than you arrived. But if I pick it up, would you really say you've been financially harmed by that 1 pence?
No.
I don't think you have you?
No.
Now, if it was £100, I think we'd say, well, hold on a minute, my choices going forward, I've got less money to spend. So I think there's been some kind of harm to the interest, to my well-being, and quite significant. £100 a lot of money, isn't it? Yeah. So building on this again, the problem I have with us is until we can, with us, and I'm a safety person, you know what I mean? The problem is until we can really figure out what we mean by harm, and we can actually expand that notion of harm, we can never be professional. We never can. What we are is we're a one-topic pony. That's what we are, a one-trick pony. That's what they call it, isn't it? Not topic. It's not called a one-topic pony. It's
I was going to say one-topic pony.
Right.
It's the first
Okay.
time I've heard of that.
Right. So what we can say here is it? Here's a question: Is it acceptable to protect you from minor harm, physical harm, and in doing so causing significant financial harm? Is that okay? So I can make sure you don't get a bruise on your knee, but you're also going to lose quite a lot of business out of that, and that's going to cause you a problem.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
No.
Why not? Why is it not? I don't expect you to answer. But we should be asking these questions, shouldn't we?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so what we're doing is, when we're thinking about safety, if we only focus on cuts and safety harm and whatever, if we only focus on that, you don't see the other stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. If I ask you to walk down the street and the old, like with the kids in the car, yellow car, red car. If you're looking for yellow cars, by the time we get home, you can tell me how many yellow cars you've seen, but you can't tell me how many blue ones you saw, can you? Because I'm focusing on yellow cars. And as a professional, we've got to think wider than just, in our case, health and safety. Like I say, the health and safety executive have been saying, in order to manage risk, health and safety professionals must be thinking about the stuff we think about, the physical harm and ill health, the ethical considerations. It must act according to society's values. That, because as a professional, that's what we do. And so harm is much bigger. And until we can start thinking about what harm is, we won't see the harm that might be arising out of our attempts to do good. And I think that's a problem.
Could I just pick up on something that, because I think that's really an interesting answer. So I was thinking, as you were saying that, if we think of harm in terms of well-being, well, it's worth having in mind that well-being isn't a kind of simple unitary thing, right? And it's possible for the same thing that harms my well-being in one respect also to benefit my well-being in another respect, right? So if you think about kind of work-life balance type cases, right? Let's say I'm doing a job that's really, really high pressured and very time demanding, and maybe I have to commute to another city to do the job, whatever. Well, as a result of that, it's almost inevitable that some of my interests are going to be harmed, right? I might see less of my family. I might be stressed. It might even have kind of physical repercussions, the stress that I'm under and so on. But the job is going to be benefiting me in other ways. Maybe I just think it's very valuable what I'm doing, or maybe it's, that was my ambition was to do this kind of job. And so I'm kind of fulfilling a personal dream by doing it. Well, then how do you kind of balance those harms and benefits? I mean, because if you're going to say, well, nobody should be harmed, well, then you're going to prevent people from putting themselves in those kinds of situations. And they might not thank you for it because on balance, they might think it's actually worthwhile to do that, right? So I think that's to say, first of all, that kind of well-being and harm can be kind of complicated in that kind of way. And the other thing to say is that brings in considerations of autonomy and consent, because actually we shouldn't just be imposing our own idea of what acceptable harm is on people. There has to be a role for them to play in determining what level of harm or benefit they're willing to accept in a given situation, right? So there has to be some respect for their autonomy. That in itself can be complicated, of course, as well, because sometimes actually people might end up in these kind of situations and they'd rather they weren't, and actually there are things that the organisation can do to make things easier for them. But at least there needs to be some consideration of, personal choice and autonomy as well in those kinds of cases.
Wow, you've given us so much food for thought. Did you have something to add, Simon?
Yeah, I mean, the point that I just want to say now is we can't even have these conversations now, and these are really important ones. So let's look at risk of harm. Okay, so when you look at risk, okay, so I'm gonna if I go to play a gamble, if I put my £10 on the horse race or whatever, I'm at risk of losing my money, but I get the benefits if it wins. Let's think about health and safety. Let's think about at work. So people at work will often be the ones who are at risk of being harmed, but they don't actually get the benefits of finishing the job or whatever. They'll get...
Well, they do, because they get paid.
Well, they'll get a small amount, but the larger benefits the benefits will go to other people. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do this, by the way. I'm just saying this is part of our discussion. Will be maybe to the business owner or to the customer, shall we say. So often what we need to think about is what people are doing. Sometimes the risk of harm is borne by the people who get the least benefit. Is that okay?
Yeah, no, not at all.
Yeah, and these are
questions that we should be asking as a profession.
Yeah. And this is going to sound like a bit of a mammoth task. If you look at something like the medical profession and their understanding of ethics, I might be wrong, but I think they've been looking at it for thousands of years and they're still working on it.
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
Well, this isn't. Oh, yeah, that's ethics done. Brilliant.
It's not a tick box exercise.
No, it isn't. No,
absolutely.
And I think it's also worth saying it does seem daunting that we've just introduced a load of complexities and those decisions are now looking really, really hard, whereas before they might have looked a bit simple. But I think it's just worth emphasising they weren't simple, right? They were never simple.
No.
But they were being made in ignorance of the complexity of them, right? And that's what you want to avoid. So you want to be as well informed about the genuine complexity. So it's not about being complicated, it's about recognizing the inherent complexity of the decisions that you're making and making them in a better informed way. You're not going to make perfect decisions, but you can start on that journey of being better informed and making better informed decisions.
That's an excellent point to end our conversation on, I think. Lots and lots to think about and go away and look into more. And if our listeners want to, I think we'd definitely look at covering this more in IOSH magazine as well. So I'm sure we'll be speaking again soon. Thank you so much for joining me in the booth today. It's been fascinating. Really great to meet you.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah, same for me as well. And now, obviously, you've got to make sure you listen to Jim's podcast.
Of course we will. Ethics Untangled.
That's right.
There we go.
Brilliant.
Thanks for listening. Join us next week for more Trailblazer Talks from the IOSH podcast.